All right, on to example 20. Now this is the first argument we have looked at that has three simple statements embedded in it. So we're going to need to use three variables, P, Q, and R. So what is one simple statement we can find in there? Well, just taking that very first, the first premise, if Micah has a fever. So the first simple statement would be Micah has a fever. And again, just a reminder, you can't say if Micah has a fever. That's not a statement. That's not a sentence. Okay, so the sentence is Micah has a fever. Q, the next simple statement. Well, finishing up that first phrase up there, if he has a fever, he can't go to school tomorrow. Well, writing that in the affirmative would be Micah can go to school. Tomorrow. And then R, the third statement. So reading the second premise, if he can't go to school, we've already got he can go to school as a statement. He can't go on the field trip. Well, again, we're going to state that in the affirmative. So he can go on the field trip. Okay, he can go on the field trip. So now what we're going to do is write this again in terms of symbols. Write this very argument in terms of symbols. So if Micah has a fever, so if P, again, the implied, then he cannot go to school. So that would be not Q. Okay. If he can't go to school tomorrow, so if, so not Q, if, okay, then, again, it doesn't say then, but it's the implied, he's not going on the field trip. So not R. The conclusion is, if Micah has a fever, which is P, then we use our if then arrow, he's not going on the field trip, so not R. Okay, now writing this out, again, in the premise and premise implies conclusion, we would have P implies not Q, and not Q implies not R, implies P implies not R. Okay, so we got a lot of things going on here in this particular case, and that's perfectly fine. Notice a lot of what we have happening, honestly, is a whole bunch of nots, okay? We need not Q's and we need not R's, and so that's one of the first things I'm going to go ahead and do is fill in a not Q and a not R column, because we're going to use those a lot. So not Q, not R. So first thing I'm going to take that Q column, I'm going to switch all of those truth values. So false, false, true, true, false, false, true, true. And the not R column, false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. Okay, because again, we're going to need those all throughout this argument. All right, next thing that I'm going to go ahead and tackle is I'm going to tackle this P implies not Q part of the argument. So P implies not Q. All right, so we are now going to be looking at column P, this one here, and my column not Q, this one here. Again, an if then, the only time an if then is false is if we have a true, if true then false. Okay, so I see an if true then false in the first row and an if true then false in the second row. Those are the only if true then falses, so that means all the rest of these are going to be true. Okay. Now, as before, I'm going to go ahead and erase my columns here. Get rid of what we got. All right, so next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move over to the not Q implies not R portion of this argument. So not Q implies not R. Okay, so now I'm going to be looking at the not Q and the not R. I'm just going to go up above there instead of trying to erase between all those. That'll make things a little easier on my end. So again, we're looking for a true in the Q column and a false, or in the not Q column, excuse me, and a false in the not R column to give us a false in the end. Okay, so I see one in the third row. I see this if true, then false. So that's a false. And then one up from the bottom, I see an if true, then false. That's a false. All the rest of those are true based on our tables of logic. Okay, so got that part all squared away and taken care of. So what would come next? Well, you got a couple options actually. You could certainly do the entire left side and just get rid of that whole thing. You could also do the statement on the right hand side. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the whole entire thing here on the left. I'm going to go ahead and focus on that whole part right there. Again, there's not a right or wrong. You just have to be sure you're using the correct columns. So I've got P implies not Q and not Q implies not R. All right, so the columns that I'm using are this one right here and this one right here, and it's an and. Okay, so remember, for an and to be true, we have to have true and true. So I'm going to go ahead and go find those. I see one about 4 down. There's 3 in a row, skip one, and then at the very bottom, everything else, if any one of those is false, the and statement is false. Okay, so as of yet, I have not done this P implies not R statement at all. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Now I got to go back a ways to find my columns. Okay, to go back, I've got to find my P column here. P implies my not R. Okay, so I'm still working from left to right, and remember, the ones that we don't want are that true, false, that gives us a false. True, true gives us a true. True, false gives us a false. True, true gives us true, and then all the rest start with falses, and so these have to be true in the end. Okay, so the last but not least thing that we need to do is take care of that very final, the final version of the argument, the one where we put everything together as one. So we would have the whole left side, P implies not Q, and not Q implies not R, implies P implies not R. Gets a little confusing, right? But again, what does it boil down to? What do we need to look at? We need to look at this column right here and this column right here, okay? This is our if, this part is our then. And so what happens whenever we do that, okay? What's the one thing we don't want? We don't want a true in the if column followed by a false in the then column. That's the one thing we don't want, okay? I don't see that happening anywhere. Anywhere we have a true in the if column, we have a true in the then column. So these are trues again all the way down. And what does that tell us? That tells us this is a valid argument.